So today I'm going to be talking about philosophically analysing the double empathy problem, applicability and neurodiversity. The aim here is to try and establish where exactly the double empathy problem occurs and where it doesn't, and then also consider how the double empathy problem relates to neurodiversity. So what I'm going to do is outline the double empathy problem. I'm then going to use philosophy of empathy to explore where the double empathy problem occurs, and then I'm going to relate the double empathy problem to neurodiversity, partially in line upon my previous analysis of using philosophy of empathy, and I'll make some additional points. So, firstly, do autistic people lack empathy? Well, this is commonly held to be a belief by scientists. For example, Schreibman talks of a lack of empathy in autism. Uta Frith talks of a lack of emotional resonance, which she takes as being indicative of a lack of empathy. This idea has long historical roots. For example, Rutter in 1978 says that autism involves a lack of empathy and a failure to perceive other people's feelings. You can go back quite significantly earlier than that to find similar ideas. I think this is most evident within Baron Cohen's notions of theory of mind deficits. So, according to Baron Cohen, autistic people are, in varying degrees, mind blind, whereby they struggle to imagine that other people have mental states. They struggle to realize that other people have emotions and desires and thoughts, things like that. And so, because they don't understand other people have such a rich mental life, autistic people can lack empathy. I think it's worth noting, though, that these people are not talking about a lack of morality. What they mean by a lack of empathy is different to what they mean by a lack of morality. They're not claiming autistic people have a lack of morality. However, the idea that autistic people lack empathy has been challenged, especially by autistic people. So, for example, Fletcher, Watson, and Bird talk of a myth of empathy deficits in autism. Milton says there's a pernicious view of autistic people lacking empathy, and Hayden says there's a misconception that autistic people lack empathy, that we don't express or feel emotion. So clearly there's a disagreement here. What's exactly going on? Well, one solution to this problem is the double empathy problem. The basic idea is that yes, autistic people do lack empathy with non autistic people, but also non autistic people lack empathy with autistic people. To quote Milton, autistic people often lack insight about non autistic spectrum perceptions and culture. Yet it is equally the case that non autistic spectrum people lack insight into the minds and culture of autistic people. So the idea is that both sides lack empathy, both sides lack understanding with each other. As such, this is, quote, a double problem because both people experience it, and so it's not a singular problem located in any one person. You can't just simply say, well, this is a problem in autistic people, because it occurs to both sides. Both sides experience it, both sides contribute to it. There is a mutual lack of understanding. We can't say that autistic people are the ones who are disordered. Quote, differences in neurology may well produce differences in sociality, but it's not a social deficit. So, yes, autistic people express and understand and process social information differently, but that doesn't mean it's a deficit, it's a difference. Both sides have a different approach, and that's what causes the lack of empathy. That's what causes the lack of understanding. Now, this is a theoretical notion, although it's one which many autistic people can relate to. However, there's also quite a lot of scientific evidence which is intended to provide support to the double empathy problem. So I'm aware of 10 different studies that are experimental or qualitative that study autistic to non autistic interactions and non autistic to autistic interactions and produce results that effectively support the double empathy problem. The 10 studies are on the right. There's a lot of variations in exactly how these studies work. I'm just going to use one of the more common techniques to outline what's generally occurring. So, what you might do is take a bunch of autistic people and put them into pairs. So you've got two autistic people together and another two autistic people together, both in pairs. Then you do the same with non-autistic people. So you've got two non-autistic people and two non-autistic people, a bunch of pairs of non-autistic people. And then you have a third type of pairing whereby you have autistic and non-autistic people together. So you've got a pair of people, one's autistic, one's non-autistic, and then another pair like that and another pair like that. And then these people interact together, and it's typically filmed, and an external observer watches the film and judges them on a variety of measurements. For example, what level of rapport they have, what level of warmth, and the ease of interaction. There's other measurements as well. There's quite a lot of different ones being used. Here's just some examples of ones being used. What's generally found is that two autistic people interacting will score just as highly as two non-autistic people interacting. So the level of rapport, the level of warmth, and the ease of interaction between two autistic people will be approximately the same as two non-autistic people interacting. However, if you look at two people interacting, one of whom is autistic and one of whom is not autistic, then they score significantly lower on things like rapport, warmth, and ease of interaction. What this seems to suggest is that the supposed lack of empathy and lack of understanding in autistic people actually only manifests when autistic people interact with non-autistic people. If you just have autistic people interacting with one another, the supposed lack of empathy and the supposed lack of understanding doesn't occur. So this then supports the double empathy problem. The problem only occurs when you have autistic to non-autistic interactions. So now I'm going to critique the double empathy problem. One key issue is, what exactly does a double empathy problem cover? So empathy is notoriously difficult to define, and it's very multifaceted. So lots of different things can constitute empathy, and also there's lots of different routes you can take to get to empathy. So it's not just one thing, and there's not just one way of accomplishing it. Scientists often demarcate between cognitive and affective empathy. Cognitive empathy relates to thoughts and seeing perspectives. Affective empathy relates to emotions. These two notions are a bit broad because we can demarcate between different types of cognition and different types of emotion when it comes to empathy. Also, they're probably too demarcated because sometimes to understand thoughts, you need to understand emotions. Sometimes to understand emotions, you need to understand thoughts. So these aren't great notions of empathy. But what I'm not sure is how the double empathy problem is meant to relate to them. So this is something that Ekdahl comments. The theory of double empathy does not explicitly align itself with any one definition of empathy. So it's not aligning itself with cognitive empathy or affective empathy or both of them or neither of them. Or at least that's the case in the, say, 30 or so papers on the double empathy problem that I've read. Also, even if we move away from technical scientific notions of empathy, it's not exactly clear how it relates to understanding, according to Ekdahl, and I agree to this. Even turning to a general or folk psychological definition of empathy, such as simply understanding the other, still arguably leaves it unclear what kind of understanding this is, how it might differ from other kinds of understanding, and what it is that breaks down. So Ekdahl says, even if we have a more general idea of two people understanding one another, it's not exactly clear what type of understanding this is. Different people might have a different understanding of what the double empathy problem is covering. What I'm just going to try and do here is use some philosophical notions of empathy to try and get an indication of what we could understand empathy to mean and then relate the double empathy problem to it. So here are 4 quotes by philosophers who talk about empathy. They all give a definition or an account of empathy. Firstly, Maybaum, quote, empathy is an attitude towards others of taking them in, of being open to their emotions and thoughts, and of being interested in understanding them. So that quote mentions emotions and thoughts. Stuber, quote, to know what other people are thinking and feeling, to emotionally engage with them, and to share with their thoughts and feelings. So that's what constitutes empathy for Stuber. Again, that mentions thinking and it also mentions emotions. Copland, quote, "The three essential features of empathy: affective matching, other-orientated perspective taking, and self-other differentiation." So that again mentions affect, which is similar to emotions, and perspective taking, which has some similarity to thoughts. So what I'm going to focus upon when I'm interested in empathy is understanding someone else's thoughts and feeling their emotions. Those are the two things I'm going to be interested in here. There's going to be other things that constitute empathy. I just want to understand if the double empathy problem relates to understanding the thoughts of someone else and feeling their emotions. These ideas are, I think, more specific than cognitive and affective empathy, or at least some versions of it, and also they're more interconnected, because to understand the thoughts of someone, you also might need to first understand their emotions, and to understand their emotions, you might also need to understand their thoughts. The two are connected. Another aspect that's important is that empathy is not typically an automatic process. It can sometimes be just a simple case of you automatically have this empathy of someone, but generally it requires effort and time and reflection. So to quote Agosta, empathy requires, quote, "a receptivity, openness to the communicability of the effect of other people." And also, Agosta says you need this in relation to thoughts as well. So, what you need to do to attain empathy is typically be open to the other person. Listen to what they have to say, potentially inquire to get more information about them, reflect upon what they have to say, and then you could be in a position where you can understand what thoughts they have and be in a position to feel what they are feeling. So, given these definitions, I'm now going to consider what I think the double empathy problem is getting right, and also what I think it might be missing out on. So, what the double empathy problem gets right is I think it's effectively conveying an account of perspective taking. So, I've never seen the double empathy problem being portrayed in these particular terms, but I think it's capturing this distinction that Copland makes. So, Copland demarcates between two different types of perspective taking. Quote, "Imagining oneself in another's situation versus imagining being another in the other situation." So if you're trying to be empathetic with someone else, and what you do is you imagine you having your characteristics in their situation, that's imagining oneself in another situation. That's different to you imagining being the other person in the other person's situation. So the first one is Tom imagines being Tom in Amy's situation. The second one is Tom imagines being Amy in Amy's situation. And the idea is that the second approach is a much better way to get empathy. Because if someone else is different to you, probably going to be feeling and thinking in a different way to you. And so this effectively captures the idea that non-autistic people are not imagining being autistic. What non-autistic people are doing are they're imagining being themselves in an autistic person's situation. What the double empathy problem is effectively saying is that non-autistic people need to imagine being autistic in an autistic person's situation. So imagine that an autistic person is stressed out and this leads to a meltdown. A non-autistic person might look at that autistic person and say, well, if I, as a non-autistic person, was in that situation, I wouldn't be having a meltdown, therefore that autistic person is being unreasonable. That's taking the first approach. What they should do is say, well, if I, as a non autistic person, was an autistic person and I was in that situation, then I might also be having a meltdown. It's actually a perfectly reasonable thing to do. So, that I think is effectively what the double empathy problem is getting right. Additionally, the double empathy problem highlights that this is actually not an easy thing to do, which fits Copland's account. So Copland says, in relation to perspective taking in general, not in relation to autism, this, quote, "is not easy, particularly when the other is someone very different from ourselves." Copland is saying that imagining being another in the other situation is challenging, especially when someone is different to ourselves. Doing this, quote, "requires mental flexibility to suppress our own perspective and requires at least some knowledge of the target." So we need to be flexible to do this. We need to take who we are and suppress aspects of that, and then start imagining having a whole bunch of new aspects, new characteristics, and to do that accurately, you need to know about the other person. So this, I think, is what the double empathy problem is effectively getting right. However, there's potentially an area where the double empathy problem is less applicable. This is feeling the emotions of another. This might not be applicable to autistic people, or at least some autistic people, including myself. So, by feeling the emotions of another, this is where one person has a bunch of emotions and someone else starts feeling those same emotions, be it literally identical or very similar ones. And this occurs due to an empathetic process, not because they've got a similar source they're both getting the emotions from. So, if both people are watching a horror film and both people start feeling scared, that's not feeling the emotions of another. That's both people feeling the same emotion due to a third source. It's you connecting with the emotions of the other person. I think I can do quite a lot of things in relation to emotions when it comes to other people, but I can't do the feeling the emotions of another. So, what can I do? I can be aware that someone has emotions. I can be aware of what emotions they have. I'm probably going to have to ask questions, but I can attain that. I can care about this. I can also be upset for them. So I might start feeling sad because they're in emotional pain or they're angry, whatever. But I am not feeling their emotions. I am not feeling their anger. I am not feeling their pain. I care about them. I can be upset for them. I might start feeling bad myself, but I'm not feeling the same emotions that they are. Whilst I can't do this, my understanding is that most people can. In lots of different accounts of empathy, which I've read about, and also from talking to other people in my personal life and also people like counselors, they say that yes, you can enter this emotional state where you're feeling the same emotions as someone else through this empathetic process. This is what, as far as I can tell, I really struggle to do. Oh, here I'm drawing upon my own lived experience, and of course, I might be misunderstanding myself, or it might not be representative. So let's look at the broader evidence. Well, firstly, I've known a lot of autistic people, both in person and interacted with online, and lots of them have said something along these same similar lines, these difficulty with emotions. They might not have expressed it in these exact terms, but I got the impression that this is what they were talking about. Additionally, I've never met an autistic person who said they actually can do this. Now, again, that's not particularly strong scientific evidence I'm offering here, but what about alexithymia? So, alexithymia, sometimes defined in different ways, but it's the idea that someone either struggles to have emotion or struggles to recognize that they have emotion. I've seen estimates that approximately 50% of autistic people have alexithymia. And so it's possible that I'm one of these alexithymic autistic people, and a fair number of autistic people I've met are also the alexithymic ones. Maybe 50% of autistic people can do this feeling the emotions of another. Maybe lots of autistic people can do this, but there does seem to be some reason to believe that a significant number of autistic people are actually going to struggle with this if we have reason to believe that something like 50% of autistic people are alexithymic. How exactly does the double empathy problem relate to feeling the emotions of another? In 30 plus papers on the double empathy problem that I've read, I'm yet to see anyone directly state how the double empathy problem relates to this particular phenomena. So let's consider some possibilities. You might say that autistic people are not different at feeling what another feels. They do this in exactly the same way as non autistic people do. That's one possibility. Another one is that autistic people are different at feeling what another feels, but it's not a disorder. They do it in a different way, but it doesn't constitute a disorder. Or maybe even they can't do it, but it doesn't constitute a disorder. Third option, they are different, and the difference takes a form of a disorder. So the way in which autistic people go about doing this, or their lack of ability to do this, it constitutes a disorder. So there's a bunch of options. I'd be interested to know what advocates of a double empathy problem feel in relation to this particular phenomena. There's 10 different studies that provide support for the double empathy problem. However, I don't think any of these support the idea that autistic people can feel the emotions of another, because all 10 of these studies are not actually looking at this. The studies are looking at things like rapport, warmth, ease of interaction. None of them are measuring feeling the emotions of another. None of them involve one person exhibiting emotions and the other person tries to feel those emotions, and then we test if this is successful or not. And then you could compare how autistic to autistic people do this, non-autistic to non-autistic, and autistic to non-autistic. That's not being measured in any of these studies. Additionally, a bigger problem is that I think 8 of the 10 studies are set up in a way where this is almost impossible to occur. So 8 of the 10 studies consist of 2 people who have never met before, having a conversation or doing a task together. Additionally, all 8 of those studies have participants interact for 5 minutes or less. That is a very short amount of time for somebody to feel the emotions of another. It's not really long enough for someone to adequately actually express the emotions they're having, but also it's not really long enough for another person to have a stance of openness, of receptivity, to listen to what the other person has to say, to inquire, to gather more information, to reflect upon it, and then engage in empathy. This type of feeling, what someone else feels, is typically something that's much more likely to occur when people have known each other for months or years. So they already know a lot about the other person, and then they've got 20 minutes, half an hour to gather more information, reflect upon it, and then that sort of feeling the emotions of another occurs. So 8 of these 10 studies, I think, are basically set up in a way that's just not going to encounter this sort of phenomena. So they're not telling us about how autistic people feel the emotions of another. 2 of those studies are qualitative ones that relate to autistic people who've known each other for a much longer time. This is a much better way to study this sort of phenomena, but neither of those 2 studies are actually looking at feeling the emotions of another person. Now, one of those studies, which interviews autistic people, does have 2 situations where an autistic person seems to say something in relation to this topic. One of those autistic people seems to suggest that actually, yes, other autistic people do get them emotionally. So potentially they're saying, yes, other autistic people can feel what I feel. Another one says, well, actually, autistic people can sometimes be quite hurtful towards me emotionally. This suggests they're not so good at feeling what another person feels. So that's 2 data points, one of which supports the double empathy problem, one of which questions its applicability. So we really need much more evidence to draw firm conclusions about this. I'm now going to relate this to neurodiversity. So how exactly does the double empathy problem relate to neurodiversity? So what is neurodiversity? It can be defined in a lot of different ways, but here's a general definition. So quoting CAP, neurodiversity is encompassing both human biological differences in cognition, brains, and genes, whilst also serving as an activist tool for change towards acceptance and inclusion of autistic and other neurodivergent people. So neurodiversity relates to the idea that some people have very different brains to other people. And also the idea is that we should try and change society to make life easier for people with those different brains, because often they struggle because society is set up for what you might call neurotypical or neuromajority or even normal brains. It is worth noting that some accounts of neurodiversity, at least historically I think, have typically emphasized that it's not compatible with disorder. If you're neurodiverse, you're not disordered. I think more recently, there's been a general acceptance that actually neurodiversity could be compatible with disorder. They just typically disagree on what is typically considered the criteria to be a disorder. So autism could be a disorder, but if we're going to think that, it's not going to be based upon the current views that, say, psychiatrists hold as to why autism is a disorder. So that's just a working definition. There's lots of different ways to understand it. Also, as mentioned, there's lots of different ways to understand the double empathy problem. What I'm going to look at now is potential ways in which there's tensions between them, whereby some accounts of neurodiversity could be in tension with some accounts of a double empathy problem. So I'm going to outline 4 different problems. Firstly, the idea that communication is relational and therefore the problems cannot be located in one person. So the idea is that when 2 people communicate, it has to be relational. It has to involve both sides. So we can't just simply say it's a problem with one side. So the idea here is, I think, that because communication has to be relational, it can't be located in just one person, so it's not a problem in just one person. I don't think that argument works because you can get properties that are relational and depend upon inner capacities. Both those two things are compatible. For example, take electrons. What is an electron? An electron is something that has a negative charge. A negative charge means that it repels things. For an electron to repel stuff, there has to be something else for it to repel. If there's nothing else for it to repel, then it can't go about repelling things. So in this sense, a negative charge seems to be relational because it depends upon 2 things, the electron and something for it to repel. At the same time, we can meaningfully say that electrons have an inner capacity to repel things. It's part of the nature of electrons to repel things. So it seems that simultaneously we can say electrons have relational properties and inner properties or inner capacities. Exactly what's going on here, how something can be both relational and inner at the same time, is a metaphysical question. But certainly it looks like large numbers of things in science seem to have both these 2 things. So to my mind, they're compatible. So that raises a possibility that actually the problem is located in one person, even though the problem occurs in a relational context. So it's potential that the inner capacity is the problem on one of the 2 sides, even though it has to occur within this relational conversation. So this opens up a possibility that there's a disorder going on. Problem 2, is it actually a disorder then, if it's possible to be a disorder? Well, all I can say is it feels like a disorder to me. To say something is a disorder depends upon what values you hold. It's a value-laden decision, and I don't have time here to discuss the values I use to demarcate disorder from non-disorder. So all I'm going to say is I think it's a disorder because I miss out on something important. So what I'm missing out on is an interpersonal emotional attunement which, according to Slaby, quote, gives rise to a richer phenomenal experience. There's aspects of my inner psychic life that are in a sense missing because I can't feel the emotions of another person, or at least it's very difficult to do. So if there's somebody I care about who's in pain, then I might care about this. I might do anything to help them, but I would also like to feel their pain because it's an additional level of connection. It's an additional way of understanding them. And I think I'm missing out on something important by either not being able to do that or finding it very difficult to do that. Problem 3. Why does it matter that autistic to autistic people score the same as non-autistic to non-autistic people in their interactions? These results are taken as supporting the double empathy problem, and also I noticed that when these results were announced, there was lots of celebrations about them by autistic people on social media. My concern here is, aren't we just using normality as a standard again? Aren't we just saying, well, autistic people are different and not disordered if they're scoring the same as normal people? Yes, they're getting there by a different means. They're scoring these similar scores even though they socialize in a different way, but it's really important that they are scoring the same as normal people. This seems to be then using normality as a standard of the good. We're now appealing to normality and saying, if you're scoring the same as normal people, then that's great. What I'm wondering is, why are we emphasizing normality? Why are we bringing normality back into this if we're taking a neurodiversity stance? Because as I understood it, neurodiversity is all about the idea that things that aren't normal can still be good. So why are we judging autistic people on how well they score and the idea that they're scoring the same as normal people? So to my mind, there's at least a slight tension there. I'm just not so sure why we should care that autistic people or scoring the same rather than scoring anything else unless you think normality is really important. Fourth problem is, why does this matter? So, as I understand it, the double empathy problem is basically saying, well, the problem's not with us, the problems actually occurs between both autistic people and non-autistic people. Therefore, non-autistic people should make more effort to understand autistic people. However, let's just assume hypothetically that the double empathy problem is wrong and it doesn't apply, that actually the problem is with autistic people, or maybe some autistic people it doesn't apply to. Or even if we take another diagnosis, imagine if we did all these studies in relation to schizophrenia and it turned out that actually there's no double empathy problem in schizophrenia. They actually do have worse communication and understanding compared to non schizophrenic people, hypothetically. Why should that make a difference to how non autistic people, or in the case of schizophrenia, non schizophrenic people, approach autistic people or schizophrenic people in the schizophrenia example? The idea is that if autistic people or whoever actually were disordered, then what happens is new moral obligations arise. Non disordered people now start having a whole bunch of moral obligations towards disordered people. So if autistic people or some autistic people actually were disordered, then non-disordered people would have an obligation to try and understand them. If the argument is that because autistic people aren't the ones causing the problem, because the problem is mutual, non-autistic people need to make more effort to understand them, well, you don't need that. You don't need that claim, because we could say whether the problem is with autistic people or it's not, non-autistic people still need to understand them. Even if autistic people are disordered, non-autistic people still have the same moral obligation to understand them. So in that regard, I think the whole idea of, well, the problem's not with us, therefore you need to make more effort to understand us, that's kind of downplaying what non-disordered people should do if somebody actually was disordered. Namely, they should still try to understand them. So, to conclude, I think the double empathy problem is effectively highlighting a particular type of perspective taking. It's effectively highlighting what non autistic people need to do to understand autistic people. I think it's getting that right. It seems to me less applicable to feeling the emotions of another person. And my claim is that there's going to be some autistic people out there who the double empathy problem is not going to be applicable towards in relation to feeling the emotions of another person. Also, the double empathy problem is compatible with a lack of empathy in autistic people. So we can say there is a double problem occurring in some regards, but also in other regards, there actually is a lack of empathy in some autistic people, and that could be a disorder. Additionally, in relation to neurodiversity, I'm not so sure why people are so enthusiastic when it was found that autistic people score the same as non autistic people, because that seems to be elevating normality. And also, it seems to be downplaying that even if there was a disorder, non autistic people still need to make the same sort of effort to understand autistic people. So here is my references. Thank you for listening.